So great, and thank you to the panel for being here. So we're at the last session before we go to the breakouts, and I just want to reiterate the title is Regulation and Policies to Promote Data Sharing and Reuse. And so I'll start off first and say I'm Steve Kern. I am the Executive Director of Global Health Labs, and previous to that I had spent 10 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I was heavily involved in trying to help solve some of the problems of data sharing that you heard my colleague Ben Pearson talk about earlier today. And so just in terms of what our process here, we'll have just a brief statement from all of the members of the panel, and then we'll go into some specific questions around this. So I'll start off with Mike Lauer, who's closest to me in terms of your perspective in the regulation and policies that would promote data sharing and reuse.
Thank you. I'm Mike Lauer. I'm the NIH Deputy Director for Extramural Research, and I think the reason why I'm here is because we recently implemented a policy that's been in the works for many years to require our grant applicants and recipients to submit data sharing plans and then actually abide by them. This has received a great deal of publicity. I saw most recently there was a piece in the New England Journal about this, and I look forward to a rich discussion.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Deven.
I'm Deven McGraw. I am the lead for data stewardship and data sharing at Invitae, which is a clinical genetic testing company. And I came to Invitae when they purchased a company that I helped to co-found that empowers patients to gather all the clinical data from all the places where they've been seen so that it's then in their hands to be able to use and share as they see fit, including for research. And I spend a lot of time thinking about data sharing, usually outside of the context of clinical trial data sharing, because we have problems with data sharing in lots and lots of contexts that is relevant to research and not just clinical trial data sharing. And there are lots of things that we have put into place from a federal level that sort of get a little bit closer to the hard law piece around really sort of almost dragging data out of people. And we're not deploying those tools in the context of clinical trial data sharing, so I think it's an interesting question which we can think about as to whether we need to take those sorts of more draconian steps in this circumstance.
All right, and then Sharon Terry.
I'm Sharon Terry. I'm the president and CEO of Genetic Alliance, which is a coalition of about 2,000 patient advocacy organizations. My interest in this is since my children were diagnosed in 1994 with a rare genetic disorder a couple days before Christmas, and I established data sharing platforms as early as 1996, which were very much laughed at in those days, and have a lot to say about from the ground up and what we should be doing to have policy actually match people's needs and expectations.
Great. Well, thank you to all the panel. So we had a series of questions that we had discussed previously that we'd like to bring forward now, and then have some questions as well that come from the audience. So first off, just starting of, what are the types of policies and infrastructure that we need to better use for data sharing? What are the things that are going to help us continue to move this field in the right direction? We heard a lot this morning about incentives, right? Having the right kinds of incentives. We talked about carrots and we talked about sticks. So is this only about sticks that are going to actually make it happen, or are we going to have to actually make sure we have carrots or other things? So Mike, I'll go to you, having the biggest stick that just recently got announced.
Yeah. I must be the sticks, although I must say I really enjoy eating carrots. We've had some interesting discussions about this internally, that while the policies and the guidance and procedures that we are setting up definitely are sticks, that this has now become terms and conditions of award, we really want to encourage incentives, and we want to think about ways in which that could be done. And I'm sure this has been discussed earlier today, that just like scientists want to publish papers, we would hope that scientists would be equally eager to publish data sets. One of my colleagues, Mike Chang, who's the director of the National Eye Institute, has done some really outstanding work with the ophthalmology community to promote data standards as well as data sharing. And he's talked about something that he refers to as an S index, as a sharing index, whereby this might be some kind of a metric that could be used in promotion and tenure and various other types of prestige measures.
I think that's a great point, because I've long argued that if I ran a clinical study that 100 people reanalyzed the data and found insights from, I would contend to all of you that that would be way more valuable to me personally and professionally than 100 people citing the primary paper that I wrote about that study. And so I think we have to change that metric in terms of understanding value. And I had made this point earlier. I think, it's within our realm to do so. For some reason, we go, oh, well, we can't because the rules are that's not valuable. But, we're the ones that describe what's valuable, right, in our own academic centers and in our own areas of research and science. So I think that's great. And one question I had for Mike as well is, do you see the day coming soon when somebody who's going to have a great score on their grant, right, they're down in the lowest, 5th percentile, doesn't get funded because they don't have a solid data sharing plan?
Well, I hope not, because I'm going to get a lot of phone calls and hate mail. That's okay. So I do see the day soon that there are going to be some big fights, so we're asking our staff to evaluate the data management sharing plans. And of course, one of the points that we've made is that if the plan is we're not going to share any data because we just don't feel like it, that won't work. One thing that we've done across the agency is we've set up a group of experts, people who really know this kind of thing, to look at difficult ones. So to look at data plans, data management sharing plans that are not straightforward or that raise interesting questions. And so an interesting question might be something along those lines, so that we can all learn from this experience and also bring those, if necessary, to NIH Central to deal with.
Great. Thank you. And Sharon, I just wanted to bring on, you came into this area from personal experience and personal motivation. So I'm curious about sort of what are the policies that you think would help individuals like yourself get more involved in promoting and moving towards the sharing policy?
Well, I run dozens of clinical trials myself and also manage a lot of advocacy groups who are now taking the bull by the horns and actually running their own clinical trials. So I'm going to take a step back, though, even from your question and say that we're in a sick system and we keep trying to manipulate everything in the sick system, which is called our healthcare system. And I would say that even the investigator-initiated funding that is available and is promoted because you would get a lot of hate mail and emails, needs to be welcomed at some point. And by that I mean, so for example, I sat on the NCATS council when Chris Austin was there, and when the CTSAs came up for being reauthorized, I said, let's just demand that they all share data. I was part of PCORI for 5 years and asked that we even share Table 1 in a public way on a public website, and the answer to all those things is no, 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 because of the system we live in. So I'm not faulting anybody at NIH or at PCORI, but I think we're not responsive to the needs of people the way other industries are. And often people say, well, this is a highly regulated industry, we can't be. And I think we could be if we got out of our own way, if we got out of our own current models and started to actually understand people need certain things and are shocked that they're not happening because we're sitting in rooms like this and we're going around somewhat in circles. And I absolutely believe we made advances in the last 5 years and last 8 years and so forth. But I think we really need to start to look at how do we be responsive. And part of that for me is you start to allow people to be full partners. And I know we have all the check boxes for patient-focused drug development and real-world evidence and all that, but it's still within this sick system. And what I've been doing for the last 28 years is building systems that actually circumvent the current ones and work with them as well, but also allow people's voices to be heard and people stay at the center and a lot of the problems go away.
That's a great point. Thank you. Deven, what do you think about incentives and things that we can do to bring people in the right direction?
Well, we started today with Bernie Lowe reminding us of what was in the original report and the recommendation right at the top around building a culture of data sharing. And even though I have a tendency to be a big fan of hard law and, where people are sluggish and not coming to the data sharing party on their own with incentives. I want to drag them there because it's so frustrating. But that doesn't create a culture of data sharing. That just creates a lot of really angry people who, march up to Congress and say, we can't do this and we need to get this overturned and there are business interests at stake, and et cetera, and here we are still having this same conversation. So I'm pretty encouraged by just how much things have improved since the report, even though we're not nearly at a level where we need to be, and incentives are part of what is getting us here. So notwithstanding that, I think it should be on the table what other kinds of really stringent soft law kinds of incentives are needed to bring the stragglers along. I think we should also spend some time thinking about what are the pain points for the entities who have adopted a culture of sharing and yet still have reluctance because of some things we haven't addressed yet. The issues around funding, the issues around risk minimization, accountability, tackling the things that keep people from playing in a really substantive way might bring us a lot farther than thinking about more draconian ways to get this done. And I'm all for disruptive models too, models that are different from the ones we have today. But we don't turn this Titanic overnight, and there's going to have to be some concessions, I think, to the current spot that we are in order to get more data to be shared without going to the step of sort of forcing people in ways that probably won't be successful in the long run. So.
That's great, and I think just the stick alone is actually just going to beat people out of the neighborhood instead of actually keeping them around to be supportive of that. I'll say one of my own experiences working at the Gates Foundation is we once ran a funding initiative where we gave people money to ask interesting questions of a pile of data that we had. And so they could actually look at the data, understand what data was present, what kinds of information was there, and then propose interesting research questions. And they were funded with money and access to the data. And so one of the interesting things that happened to that, we funded, I think, maybe a dozen or so groups. There was another dozen group of people that wanted to stay involved just because they wanted access to the data. They said, even without the money, we just actually are interested in accessing the data. And it started to build this community of people who are asking really curious questions about this data. And so I think, setting up those incentives where people can win and then providing them with the right kinds of tools to be able to move forward and succeed, I think is going to be really one of the key areas. I'm curious if there's, I often am amazed when I'm sitting in these conversations that the biomedicine field kind of approaches it sometimes, I think, as if this is our unique problem. And we, of course, know that a whole bunch of other areas have tackled this problem. In fact, the physicists and the economists sometimes look at us and go, you're struggling with what? Right? So I'm just curious, are there examples that you're aware of, Sharon, from other fields perhaps that we could learn better ways to drive this forward?
Yeah, I could think of at least two off the top of my head. One we took up years and years ago when I co-founded the Genomics Forum for what was then the Institute of Medicine. And we studied the semiconductor industry during the Cold War as an example of what could happen if we thought this was as important as the Cold War. We don't have eyes on the problem of suffering in the world the way we do on something like that. And so there were a lot of lessons learned, and we wrote a report, and I think we still could implement some of those things. And the other place I go, for examples, is what's happened everywhere in ride sharing and music sharing and all the other things that showed the industries they would not be in demise. People still want to listen to music and still want to read things from the open access journals and so forth. The fears that they had did not come to fruition because the business model shifted. So while I think you could make a stick, for example, if NIH said all CTSAs must share data, let's imagine that wild scenario, I doubt there would be all the CTSA leadership running away from applying for those essentially billions of dollars in grants. So I think it would be a good experiment and maybe a kind of safe harbor pilot that would be big enough to make a difference.
Well, and in fact, I think, maybe this is one of the pilots that Monica was referring to today at lunch, but there sort of was an effort around that in COVID from the CTSAs to share data, and that was actually, I think, quite successful, and it brought together a really interesting community of people who are still continuing to work on that. I don't know, Mike, if that's something you wanted to speak to, or
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's one of the positive lessons from the pandemic was the N3C experience, and that worked out well.
And Deven, are there other examples that you're aware of that from other areas that we might be able to learn how to move forward in this space of sharing?
Well, this is not an example yet, but it is something to keep an eye on. I alluded to this in my earlier remarks. So, the Congress in the 21st Century Cures Act passed these information blocking rules that essentially create penalties for certain actors in the healthcare system that are not sharing electronic health information for any purpose for which it is lawful to share it. It's been frequently understood to be a law about the patient's right to be able to get access to all the clinical data that's generated about them in a clinical context, but it is not limited to patient access to data. It is actually, if you are a healthcare provider, if you're a certified electronic medical record vendor, or if you're a health information exchange, you're subject to this law that basically says the electronic health information that is used to make clinical decisions about patients or payment decisions about patients is subject to being shared. And if you don't share it, and you don't have a legal reason why you can't share it, or some other excuse that is actually makes sense, and there are some safe harbor excuses that are already built into the law, you're going to potentially be penalized for that. And we are just beginning to be at the point of enforcement of that law. We have no idea whether it's going to work. We have no idea whether it's going to be legally challenged. We have seen nothing yet in terms of penalty assessment. It's something to keep an eye on, because it is really comes as close to a hard law requirement around sharing that I know of, and it is deliberately intended to get data shared for treatment, to get data shared for public health, to get data shared with patients when it's required, and frankly could be extended to research, although that has not been identified as a priority use case by the enforcing authorities as of yet. Something, again, to keep an eye on. Way too early to say that it would work in this context as well.
Thanks. Well, this was reminding me of one of the challenges that it kind of got resonant in my brain this morning, listening to Jeff Drazen talk about some of the issues from his own perspective in New England Journal, and I was one of the data parasites that Jeff first called out. We gave him a T-shirt that said, "Actually, I'm a data symbiont," and he wore it for us and really took a nice picture. But one of the things that I get concerned about in my own experience in trying to work on data sharing is that it's everybody's burden and it's nobody's job. There's no one whose job it is to actually be the aggregator, harmonizer of the data. And when we were working on COVID and trying to think about how do we bring data together for sharing, certainly COVID, a global pandemic, everyone would of course share data because we all want to solve the problem, right? Wrong. What we actually were fortunate because we were part of a collaboration that involved MasterCard. So MasterCard started to talk to us about what they do in the financial services business. And as I think Monica mentioned before, that Amazon knows what kind of shampoo she has. They probably know how much she's paid for it 3 times as well, too. Partly because there's a huge amount of all of our financial transactions that we all engage in every day that's shared globally across the world, and that's managed and operated by a system that has rules in place. So one of the things that was really interesting that MasterCard did was set up a data trust, right? So they set up somebody whose job it was to run the rails of where the data can go, how it can move, what are the rules of the game, how can we engage that? And they were an independent entity that basically was set up to be the arbiter of how the data flew. And I think if we thought about that in the biomedicine world, that might create an opportunity where, again, somebody says, hey, that's my job, that's what I'm doing, because a lot of us are doing this on top of our other day job, and that's a challenge. Go ahead.
Yeah. What was your business model? How did it work?
Yeah, that was a great question. They probably were deriving some, I don't know exactly how it worked. That's a great question, because they must have been getting funded by the financial people that were basically paying as a subscription to be able to say, okay, how can we go forward? But I think that's a key element. If I look at Vivli, Rebecca and Barbara, when I was in the Gates Foundation and I was overseeing a portfolio where I could have invested in Vivli, came to me and said, can you give us a grant to get Vivli off the ground? And I said, no, because 5 years from now when the grant expires, you're going to ask me for another grant to do the same thing. And how wrong I was, because, but I think I gave you the right answer at the time because you developed a model that worked, which was really great. I wouldn't say that I'm the catalyst, but yeah. Nonetheless. Go ahead.
Just to set the record straight, you said if you develop Vivli Kigali, we'll look at it.
Exactly.
Just to say.
Fair enough. And I'm still waiting for Vivli Kigali, but maybe it's going to come. I think the financial model is something not to be overlooked. And the key that we started to think about, at least at the Gates Foundation, is we could probably put $50,000 into every big grant that we gave, and it would cover the data costs for curation and storage and processing. And for the size of some of the awards that we give out, that's a rounding error, right? So it's sort of like, why wouldn't you just put that in the first place and say, here's an extra chunk of money, you can go now do this, but you're obligated to actually go and do that. And I don't know if that's a model that NIH is thinking about at all or not.
So what's interesting, we explicitly have given guidance, we've been very open about this, that costs for data curation, management, and sharing are legitimate costs. They can be taken off as the direct cost from a grant. And during the first few cycles, we actually had a line on the budget forms, enter in your data costs here. Many people filled in 0. Now, it's kind of complicated. It's not because they didn't want to ask for any money, but it's because they were worried about various auditing regulations and how that might be affected. Because sometimes it's just not so easy to pigeonhole data costs into one specific category. So now we've done a few other things, but nonetheless, we haven't done a formal analysis of this yet. But people are really not asking for money. I don't want the word to come out here that, especially this year with the budget, that people should start asking us for massive amounts of money. But we recognize this, and we've been very open about this, and we do invite people to talk about how much they think it will cost. And in fact, that's the one and only thing that we're asking from peer review. So we're not asking peer review to assess the data management sharing plans, because that's more a responsibility that's on us, it's on the agency. But we are asking them to look at the budget justification and just give a sense as to whether or not the ballpark figure seems to be about right.
That's great. I think that's going to be real important data and experience to learn over the initial stage of this as it goes forward. So that's great. Deven, any thoughts in your mind about the incentives from a financial standpoint and how we can help align them in the right directions?
Well, one thing that does occur to me from what Michael was just saying is that there may be a number of proposals where they just have no idea how much it costs because they're not accustomed to what it takes to turn yourself into not just an analytics shop, but an actual data production, gathering, curation shop where the data is not just going to be used internally, but is actually going to have to be made available in an enclave or shipped out onto another platform for someone else to use, and all the metadata that needs to go with that so people understand how it was generated and things of that nature. Like, no idea how that costs for probably a number of folks for whom this is very new. So I think some practical guidance for people about just what it takes for different data sets and some examples would probably help move that number from 0 to something that's a little bit more plausible. I also recall that in the original report, we discussed this issue a fair amount and thought, there needs to be some way to distribute the costs and burdens in some way that is at least fair, if not equal, among all who benefit. And the public benefits from this data sharing. And yet we don't have a regularized way of helping to fund all of that. There are sort of numerous ways that you could think about it. A small tax on premiums goes into data sharing, supports data sharing across the country. I'm very U.S. based in my mind here, but it's, we all, if we're trying to create this ecosystem where data sharing is the norm, where publication of results, good or bad, is the norm, where we have the sort of learning systems that we all want and deserve, we should be paying for that to some degree, and instead we're asking certain sectors to support that cost, and we're asking people who want grants to support that cost. So I guess some public money is coming at, to the extent that some of that funding can be devoted to those costs, but that's not really a systemic way of dealing with it.
So those are really great points. And Sharon, I wanted to also throw in, just from the perspective of, and not to just pigeonhole you into the space of the voice of the patient, but that was one of the questions that we had teed up to think about is, how do you think the voice of the patients would think about, I'd actually be willing to even contribute a little bit towards the ability to learn more from my data? Or maybe that's already a tacit assumption that you're trying to get the most out of the data you've already asked me to donate to you.
Yeah, so we've built a model that does exactly that, and they don't contribute anything financially to that, but they do keep a string on their own data and make decisions about where it's going to go and where it's going to be shared. The tough part of it is, so we work with a company called Luna, and they're funded by venture capital money, and they have models around access, not selling data, but access to data with pharma, with us, with collaboratives. And the people are really excited to have their data shared. I'm with Jane in saying it's not because of data sharing that people are not joining clinical trials. I would say it's because we keep relying on single clinicians to recruit for a trial when that person has his or her 7 minutes and it's not their primary activity. But instead, communities, which are well under-resourced and underserved in a certain way, are armies to have this done. And I mean communities writ large, soccer teams, churches, temples, mosques, and so on. If we involved people more, we would have much more activity and we'd have much more funding, I think, overall. But we need to seed that, and no entity supports us communities in doing this work. VCs won't because there's no ROI, the kind that they're looking for. NIH doesn't because it doesn't fund communities except through the Office of Rare Diseases, and not so much anymore because they're moving away from registries and communities. And foundations have a hard time supporting anybody like us who does umbrella work. They'd rather support one disease over another. And so I think people are ready, willing, and able to share, and do share when they're invited, when they feel like it's safe. And again, they're not just going to feel it's safe because the clinician said it. They're going to feel safe because their community said, this is what we're all doing. Let's join in together. This is our thing. Let's wear the patch on our sleeve. And then we would see far more involvement.
And for what it's worth, just speaking from personal experience, so at NIH we set up the All of Us study. So I guess I could say I'm part of the All of Us community, and so all of us came to visit NIH and invited us to join. So I joined. I'm a participant in the study, and it was quite an interesting experience to go through the informed consent. It was very well done. They had quizzes. I got a few of the questions wrong, but one of the key aspects was about data sharing, and you could just define what level of data sharing you were comfortable with, and I think I was like not at the top level, but the second to top level, and that included they were pulling in data from our electronic health record, and you had to go through a series of steps for that, but. I think part of the reason why I was enthusiastic about joining the study was because, in a way, we were part of that community. This was, we were one of the many communities, the NIH campus, but we were one of the many communities that All of Us has touched. So from my own personal experience, I'll echo what you just said, Sharon.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of really good exemplar successes that we can focus on and learn from in this space. I think we tend to focus on the hard parts and the challenges and the failures, but in fact, there's probably just as many successes that are working. That's a great example that you just mentioned. I know when I first started to explore this space, I came across the Lamb Foundation, and I was just blown away by this ability of a small group of women in a disease, a rare disease that affects mostly women in their 30s, right, to be able to actually self-organize, get their physicians to share data across their own iPhones on a platform they developed, that then they motivated all the way towards creating the ability of rapamycin to be indicated as a therapeutic in their own disease, where no one else had financial incentives to do it. So I think there's a huge amount of potential, and I think we should not in any way underwrite or under-dismiss the potential of the patients who really actually want to be partners with us in this effort and move it in the right direction.